I really hope having that toy above my head doesn't backfire on me. Anyway, hello and welcome to or back to my channel. I'm Kit and here we talk about harmful nonsense. And today we're going to discuss female submission as explained by Girl Defined. Before we get into it, I would like to note that I don't know Kristen or Shannon, and these are my thoughts and opinions on the content they put out for public consumption. That being said, thank you for clicking on this video, and I would like to give extra thanks to my patrons. Links to my socials and Patreon are below, along with sources and resources. And now, on to the reason we're all here. Girl Defined is a Christian ministry run by two sisters, Bethany and Kristen, and a few weeks ago, Kristen had Shannon Popkin on their podcast to discuss submission. Shannon is an author, speaker, and host of the podcast Live Like It's True, where she invites you to open your Bible, drink deeply of God's story, and live like it's true. We're just going to dive right in, but if I seem a bit spicy, I just finished The Woman They Wanted by Shannon Harris, and I've been binging, believe it or not, so my patience for this nonsense is lower than usual. Anyway, before we begin, I want to note that this isn't about Christianity in general, this is about Girl Defined's interpretation of it. We open with Kristen saying submission can feel complicated and confusing to understand, and her first question is why Shannon thinks Christian women have so many questions and feel so confused about the topic. I'm not Shannon, but my guess is, besides the fact that everyone has different ideas of what submission is and what it entails, essentially, women are supposed to be submissive, but they're also supposed to invite him to lead, aka lead him to leadership. Make it make sense. Anyway, as we'll see in this video, Girl Defined, for once, isn't the worst, but I still find the reasoning for submission lacking. Shannon, of course, has a different answer. She thinks it's the independent culture we live in that celebrates a woman rising up and being her own entity. Only in Girl Defined's brand of Christianity is being your own person a bad thing. Anyway, Shannon says she thinks some may have overreacted to society and overextended the principles of submission, and I can see that. But at the end of the day, you're all still saying that the man has the final word. The reasons for it vary, the circumstances vary, but at the end of the day, his word is law. The path one takes to get there doesn't matter so much. Back to the video, Shannon says humans don't like submitting in general, and please tell me she's not trying to liken women to toddlers.
We love to not be submitting to anyone. I mean, look at a 2-year-old, right? No, me do it, me self, right?
Yes.
That's just how
so true.
We are born this way.
A big theme I'm noticing right away is control. And it's very interesting to me that per these two, women wanting to make decisions and do things is controlling, and that's bad. But if it's a man, well, that's his right, and women need to get out of his way. Shannon also tells us that it's not natural for humans to be submissive, but as we become more like Jesus, it's who we are becoming little by little, and let's be honest. They don't want individuals, they want blind obedience and submission. They say to Jesus, but in reality, it's to church leadership. Anyway, Kristen says that, like most women, she struggles to submit, and then she decides to tell us the two extremes she's seen.
On one hand, the extreme in their marriage is the husband is very dominant. He takes his leadership and his authority to a point that I think is very unbiblical, borderline abusive, verbally and physically. Just, I'm the one in control. I'm the leader. I will do everything. And, the wife's just sitting there like a little doormat. And I know that's not a biblical understanding of submission or the way that they're living it out. And on the other side, I've talked to wives and couples where they're like, you know what? Submission's kind of an outdated idea. It's, maybe Bible times it had a different meaning, but for us today as modern Christians, it's not really relevant. It's not really something that we're supposed to embrace. I mean, it's actually quite sexist. I've heard Christians say that. So it's just something in our marriage that we don't really embrace in any way.
Kristen, one of these things is not like the other. You can't compare a couple deciding submission is sexist and outdated and they're not going to follow it in their own marriage to a husband being, in her own words, borderline verbally and physically abusive. Kristen said she's seen this, so I would like to know, did she just silently judge, or did she try to help the wife and at least alert someone? Honestly, Kristen has no sense of proportion, and neither does Shannon. She just nods and says we should find comfort in God's word and imagine how we would be floundering without it. For anyone wondering, Shannon is also a strong woman who struggles with submission. On to the basics. Shannon's basis for submission is Genesis, where woman was created from man, man named woman. God gave Adam the instruction not to eat from the tree. So by that measure then, Eve didn't actually do anything wrong. Did she even know the tree was off limits? Did she think the tree was off limits only for Adam? And afterwards, when God visited the garden, he called for Adam, not for Adam and Eve, and so, clearly, there is an order there. Shannon says story is more important in the Middle East, and God is clearly showing us something. From the way Shannon describes it, God is showing that man is a terrible leader, but her takeaway is, of course, the opposite. Shannon waxes poetic about marriage, and then she asks us to imagine there was no such thing as marriage or parent-child relationships. Per Shannon, these are the context for God to say, I love you the way a bride loves his wife, and I think she meant to say bridegroom. She also tells us that God has good things in mind for us when he tells wives to submit, and I'm just quietly side-eyeing that statement because I don't think forcing people to withhold their natural inclinations or forcing people to step into a role they're not suited for and don't want counts as good intentions. But hey, I'm a disobedient Jezebel. Back to Shannon, she tells us that ever since Eve, women have sought control. Eve ate the apple because she didn't want to submit to God, she wanted to be on par with God, and her desire for her husband is actually a desire to control him. Shannon, of course, says a lot more than this, and I'll link the video below if you'd like to watch it in full, but are they aware that they make religion sound like an abusive relationship? Shannon goes on to say that she wants control over the stupidest little things and every little nitpicky thing, and if you seriously can't control yourself from seeking to control everything and everyone around you, you should look into therapy, not submission. But about 75% of me is pretty sure that when these women say this, they're playing up their resistance to submission for their audience. But you know what? Forget therapy. What you really need is John Piper.
I was painting the laundry room, and for some reason I was listening to a sermon by John Piper, and he's laying this all out. And I remember just being stunned on the side of my ladder with paint like dripping off my brush. Like, no wonder I love my husband, but why am I emasculating him? Why am I constantly talking over him? Why is our relationship so hard?
I'm supposed to believe that an adult woman who's been married however long didn't know how to behave in familial relationships, or worse yet, didn't care to? She cared so little for her husband, she didn't even practice the golden rule toward him? And the only reason she can be a halfway decent person is because she practices biblical submission? Mark me down as skeptical. Of course, this is all because she's a daughter of Eve. I guess I must be a daughter of Lilith then, because I've never treated that way and I don't even believe in submission. Anyway, they chat for a bit more, and then we finally get to the big question. What is God calling women to in submission? Shannon starts off talking about mutual submission, and then...
Because see, we have certain powers over each other. You know, a husband has physical power. Husbands, they have more strength than wives. And wives, we have this power over our husbands. We've talked about negative things, but we communicate really well. I know I can sometimes talk circles around my husband, relationally. I'm more intuitive. I have certain ways that I know how to get control. One of the words in my particular marriage, if I use this word, if I want to get control over a situation, if I want him to do what I want, all I have to do is say to him, you're just lazy.
So in short, mutual submission is important because men are strong and can physically hurt you, and women are crafty and can verbally hurt you. It's so interesting how these folks talk about non-submissive marriages like they're always contentious, and I can only conclude that either marriage is a nightmare or these folks married people they don't really like, let alone love. Why is it so hard for these Christians to treat other people with basic respect because it's the right thing to do? Why do they have to make up all these rules about submission and God intended this, but Eve did that, and so that's why I'm a horrible person? Shannon says submission doesn't mean going along with his every preference because they're co-heirs of the gospel, and I can hear the transformed wife writing Shannon off as a feminist, and
there's only a call for submission when we disagree.
Louise would like a word. I am glad to hear Shannon say that submission isn't acquiescing to his every preference, but...
And when there is a 1-to-1 vote, then I give my vote to him. That's what submission is.
I would ask why, but I already know the answer. Because God made Adam first. God gave woman the desire to control, the will to lead, the courage to go first, but women must step back and let men do that because God, well, he didn't say so, but you can infer it. And this is not me shitting on men. This is just how it sounds when I hear these folks talk about submission. They always make the women sound so confident and capable and the men so diffident. Anyway, Shannon goes on to give some examples. She wanted to homeschool, her husband said no, and once she had some friends over and she was going to bring the kids down because she could hear them crying, but her husband said no, he had put them to bed. I will say that Shannon said if your husband is disrespecting you, you should tell someone and get their advice, and if your husband is doing something you could call 911 for and he would be arrested, you should call, and wives are not to submit to abuse. However, she then says this.
I think most of the time we're in situations though where we could call 911 and they would come and they'd be like, lady, stop calling us. This is not, this is silly.
If they don't ignore or dismiss abuse, they have to diminish it. Why? They're advising women to submit to their husbands, and though Shannon isn't as bad as others I've covered on my channel, can they not see how that situation could easily turn? They try to dress it up with flowers, but the husband is essentially Jesus, and power corrupts. Even if you start off with someone well-intentioned, that could so easily go to their head. Shannon also says this.
I mean, women oftentimes are a stronger leader. There are many things that I'm better at him, but yet he still makes decisions that I submit to him on.
This is just bleak. I would ask why then they want women to forfeit their natural talents and force men into leadership roles, but of course, God. Well, not even God, just some humans that have interpreted God's actions as women submit. There are plenty of Christians who don't believe in or practice submission, and I'll again recommend The Making of Biblical Womanhood by Beth Allison Barr. Anyway, one last thing.
We all have husbands who are selfish and immature and disrespectful to us. And so how are we going to respond to that? Yeah. Well, this verse encourages us, to have an influence over him, not with our words, but how we respond. Let me just read the rest of that verse. That some may be won over without a word by the way that their wives live when they observe your pure, reverent lives. Like, what if that was what your husband got to live with? A pure, reverent life, a woman submitting to God's design for marriage. I mean, that is so compelling. And you do have a primary influence in his life. Don't waste it.
I hate to be the thrower of cold water, but that's what Bethany is doing now. She's submitting to Dave and trying to win him back to Jesus without a word, which strikes me as a strange way to live, but honestly, the way all of these people talk about marriage is strange. It's like they assume spouses are strangers to one another, if not outright hostile. Or perhaps they lean into the we're different creatures too much and thus assume men and women can't communicate effectively without that framework for marriage they believe the Bible has laid out. Well, good job to Girl Defined for not being the worst for once. I trust this won't last long. And I think that'll about do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.